Welcome to Nourish MD, Doctor Dietitian Dialogues, where doctors and dietitians empower you about your health and discuss and provide a better path to health and wellness. Proudly presented by Concierge Medical Practice Private Physicians Medical Associates, PPMA, with your hosts, Registered Dietitians and Nutritionists, Lauren Papanos and Romana Brennan.
Hello and welcome to the Nourish MD podcast. My name is Romana. I'm one of your registered dietitians and hosts today.
And I'm Lauren. I'm your other registered dietitian and host of Nourish MDs. And we're so excited to talk with you today about anti-inflammatory nutrition strategies. So Romana, why don't you kick things off?
Yeah, so if you were with us last week, be sure if you haven't listened to the episode yet with Dr. Boz, make sure that you do that after this. He's a rheumatologist at UCI. We were super excited to have a great conversation with him. Just as a reminder, coming off of that episode, inflammation is a normal part of the body's tissue healing process and immune function. So inflammation in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's a really important part of our natural body's processes. However, when this inflammation becomes chronic is really when it becomes a problem, and it can open the door to other comorbidities and health challenges. So today we're going to be diving into anti-inflammatory diet strategies in this episode. So Lauren, why don't you start us off by talking us through some of the symptoms or other health issues in which inflammation is often at the core of the issue?
Yeah, I think that it can span so far and wide, and so many of our current health challenges and symptoms have inflammation at the core. And inflammation can mean a lot of different things. And like you mentioned, in acute states, so in the short term, it's not harmful for us. But when this low-grade inflammation becomes chronic, where we're dealing with it on an everyday basis, and our body doesn't have the capacity to essentially fight off that inflammation at a faster rate than that inflammation is building, that's when it really creates havoc in the body. And we can see this show up metabolically, and that can be in situations of, maybe you've noticed weight loss resistance. You're having a lot of difficulties losing weight. You've gained weight and you feel like you haven't changed much within your exercise or your lifestyle habits. This can show up within your blood work, and that could be that your fasting blood glucose or your A1C is creeping up. It's above range. You're having difficulties with getting it under control through some of the maybe baseline strategies you used to do before. This could show up with elevated triglycerides or with issues with your cholesterol levels, with high blood pressure. And so we can see this reflected on a day-to-day basis and maybe how you're feeling, but then also within your blood testing as well. Some of the other common symptoms can include things like joint and muscle pain. And Dr. Boz talked about that quite a bit as a rheumatologist, right? That's something that he deals with every day, is individuals that are having a lot of pain, that are having chronic pain, that are having joint and muscle and discomfort in these areas of the body. There's also digestive issues that can be at play. And this might show up for you as things like indigestion or constipation, loose stools that are often happening. But there might be something deeper rooted that either has been identified through testing or maybe hasn't been, because the digestive system can be so tricky to really identify what is actually causing some of that inflammation. And then I think on a more hormonal scale, we see a lot of things reflected with issues like headaches and mood issues. We know that inflammation is one of the drivers of even depression. And so inflammation can cause things like low mood and more of a depressive state. It can cause cognitive dysfunction, cognitive decline as well. And so really the symptoms for inflammation can span so far and wide, and the ability for what we eat to change how these inflammatory processes in the body are happening is incredibly profound, because if you think about it, food has the power, it has chemicals, natural chemicals in it, right, that have the power to either fight or to fuel the inflammatory processes.
Yeah, I love all of those things that you touched on. I think it helps give really concrete examples of just how many body systems can be involved. Similar to how widespread these inflammatory symptoms can manifest, we can also think about how there are different factors that can influence inflammation. It might not just be that you have a digestive issue, but maybe you're experiencing a wide variety of symptoms, and there are a wide variety of factors that are contributing. So it can be helpful to have this conversation, especially from a nutrition piece, because it might not just be one thing that's fueling your inflammation. And so I hope that we can have some broad takeaways for you all today, and then also following up for those PPMA patients in our group session with you, Lauren, to get some additional really, really tangible takeaways. And just as you had mentioned, this nutritional approach to inflammation, it's more than just adding or subtracting. It's really strategically utilizing these foods that we know have anti-inflammatory properties, but also can contribute to overall a healthier lifestyle. And we're going to talk more today about why is X food good for us? Well, it contributes to the body in this way by this mechanism. So I hope that that's helpful for everyone today.
Yeah. And I think anyone can just go and Google search like anti-inflammatory diet and can probably learn something about the Mediterranean eating pattern, or, turmeric and fish oil and omega-3s and things of that sort, right? And while we are going to cover some of these foods that have really potent anti-inflammatory compounds in them, I think it's so important to note that inflammation can be a very complex process in terms of how it presents in the body. And with complex doesn't mean that we can't use food to be able to support that. It just means that we may need to use different mechanisms of food to be able to help resolve that inflammation. So maybe we can just first start off by talking about the foods that can fuel inflammation. So these are the foods that we see to be problematic for some individuals that are driving an inflammatory response. And then after, we can get into some of these more like medicinal foods that are helping to be able to fight that inflammation and act as anti-inflammatories. So Romana, could you just start off by telling us of some of these common foods that we see that are fueling and driving a lot of inflammatory processes and how they're doing that?
So I want to start off by first talking about this class of added sugars, artificial sugars. And when we're talking about inflammation, one process in the body that we know can be a potential trigger for inflammation that you had mentioned earlier, Lauren, is that blood sugar balance. So if our blood sugar is out of balance, if we're having what we call insulin resistance, so decreased sensitivity to insulin, which is a hormone that helps mobilize glucose in the body, we might be experiencing these hyperglycemic glucose spikes. Maybe that's followed by hypoglycemia, where our blood glucose then falls lower. We know that both of those responses, whether our glucose is high, whether our glucose is low, these can both be seen by the body as an inflammatory type trigger and can fuel that inflammation process. So we want to just be mindful of these added sugars, these artificial sugars that are going to spike our blood sugar, not just eliminating any one of these sources, but kind of doing a dietary audit, if you will, and noticing in my condiments, in my salad dressings, these are all the sneaky little places where these added sugars can crop up. But we're talking about agave nectar, super high in fructose. We know that fructose impacts the liver because that's where it's processed, as opposed to more of like a glucose forward type sugar. So agave nectar, even honey and maple syrup, these are more of our natural sugars, but we want to just be aware of how much of these foods that we're getting in our diet. Sucralose, erythritol, these are more of leaning toward those artificial sugars, erythritol being a sugar alcohol. Any sugar type substitute that ends in OL is sugar alcohol. And then high fructose corn syrup, which we are all very familiar with. Again, high in fructose, processed by the liver. If we're overloaded on this fructose, it can tax our liver, can potentially lead to fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So we want to, again, just be mindful of how many different places in the diet are these types of things showing up. If we're having all of these added sugars with our breakfast, how is that spiking our blood sugar and then setting us up for the rest of the day? Are we going to then be on this blood sugar roller coaster for the rest of the day, where we might notice some of those headaches, some of those mood changes, the afternoon energy crash, and the highs and lows that can further contribute to inflammation?
Yeah. And I think sugar is a huge piece that a lot of times can be sneaky for people. And like those products, like you mentioned, you might not be outright adding these to foods, but they are in a lot of foods at restaurants that you might be eating salmon. You're like, oh, I think this salmon's great. Or I'm eating Brussels sprouts, great for me. But the Brussels sprouts of salmon have tons of honey on them for making them taste really good, right? So these are just things we need to draw awareness to. Outside of sugar, I think that The other two that are really big triggers for a lot of people are both gluten and dairy. And gluten in itself is problematic because a lot of people have what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where they don't have an allergy to gluten, but their immune system is still reacting. They're still highly sensitive to the protein that is in wheat, which is gluten. Gluten is found in wheat, barley, and rye, and what is the protein structure. So it's different than like lactose, right? A lot of times people try to think of like gluten versus lactose sensitivity. It's very different because lactose is sugar, which basically means your digestive system doesn't have enough enzymes to break down that lactose. It doesn't have enough lactase to do that. Whereas with gluten, it's totally different. It's not a lack of enzymes. It's an actual immune response that's happening. And that's why even very small amounts of it can create an inflammatory response. And unfortunately, in the US, there's so much modification of this gluten protein that's happened. This is why I believe that so many people have issues with gluten, is because it's just not what our immune system was exposed to as a young kid. It looks so different in our body. Our immune system is like, well, what is this foreign thing that I never knew how to build an immunity to, because it has been modified and it's changed so much. And gluten can be found, like I said, in wheat, barley, and rye, but it can also be more sneakily in things like soy sauce and teriyaki sauces, meatballs, some of your even protein sources that maybe aren't so obvious. Dairy, on the other hand, there's research that shows about 70% of people have an inflammatory response to dairy. And that's because of the protein structure that's in dairy. Most of the dairy, the cows that are used in the US dairy supply, they contain a high amount of something called beta-casomorphin. And that can be extremely inflammatory. And those symptoms can range far wide for people, but it could be like you're having to clear your throat after you consume it. You notice you get postnasal drip. A lot of these more upper respiratory type symptoms, sometimes skin issues for people as well. And so not everyone has an issue here, but it's something to be mindful of. We find that dairy can be a little bit less inflammatory if it's a different type of protein. So most of this traditional dairy in the US is A1 protein, but there is a different type of dairy. It comes from a different type of cow that is A2 protein. And A2 protein tends to be a little bit less problematic. Still doesn't necessarily mean that it's a safe option for everyone, but it can be a safer option that's a bit easier to digest, a little bit less inflammatory, because there's not as much that beta-casomorphin in there. And that's predominantly what's found in things like sheep's and goat's milk. So if you're getting feta cheese and such, that is mainly A2, but you can also purchase A2 as a milk or as a yogurt source as well, if that is something that you need to do. Now, outside of the gluten and dairies that I really think are probably two of the biggest sources that people are eating the most every day, there's other more sneaky sources that maybe we're not even aware of that are coming into our food supply because we don't see them and we don't really taste them. What are those, Romana, and why are these impactful for us?
Yes, definitely sneaky and found, especially now, in a lot of processed foods, dressings, anything of that sort that might be more on the process end are these hydrogenated vegetable oils. So what that might look like in an ingredient list: high oleic canola oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil. Even things like palm oil tend to be slightly less refined, but still can be what is called hydrogenated. So the hydrogenation process is utilized so that these oils are more stable, so that whatever it's being added to is more shelf stable and lasts a longer time, so that these oils don't become rancid as easily. But this hydrogenation process does involve some pretty intense chemicals, hexane, for example. So we want to try to limit or eliminate that as best as possible. So aside from just how these oils are created, manufactured, processed, these are also sources of omega-6 fatty acids in the diet. So omega-6 fatty acids sound similar to omega-3 fatty acids, but they do differ. So both of these types of fatty acids are polyunsaturated fatty acids. They are essential fatty acids. That means if something is an essential fatty acid, we need to get it through food. Our body cannot make it. So within this category of these polyunsaturated fats, we really want to prioritize more of the omega-3s as opposed to the omega-6s. And we'll talk more about that because they're more on the fighting inflammation side of things. But when it comes to the omega-6s, again, circling back to those hydrogenated vegetable oils, we want to limit these sources of oils as much as possible. These omega-6s, they can be inflammatory. Again, sunflower oils, canola oils, those are going to be the main ones that you see. And oftentimes you'll see canola oil and or sunflower oil and or safflower oil on some of these ingredient lists. So always helpful to take a peek at the back of any kind of packaged foods that we're eating to make sure that we are being mindful of that. Even soybean oil, things like that as well.
Enjoy high-quality supplements shipped right to your door with full script through Private Physicians Medical Associates, PPMA. Reap the health benefits of pharmaceutical-grade vitamins while saving 5% on all orders. Set up your free PPMA account today. Visit privatemds.com.
But Lauren, let's move on from the hydrogenated vegetable oils. Can you tell us about some other sources of these classes of foods that might be fueling some inflammation in the body?
Yeah, well, you mentioned omega-6s, and like you mentioned, omega-6s are an essential fat. So we do need some omega-6s, but we need them to be in balance with omega-3s. We need a lot more omega-3s than we do need omega-6s to be able to keep us into an anti-inflammatory state. And unfortunately, what we see often is that most people have very low omega-3 indexes, very low omega-3 levels, and they have pretty high omega-6 levels because omega-6s are just a lot more rampant in the diet. Other things outside of these oils that you mentioned are foods that are high in omega-6, which are commonly things like corn or soy. And corn is obviously found in things like corn tortillas and corn chips and such. But soy, it can also be found in things like tempeh and tofu and edamame. And it might be a large protein source for a lot of individuals that are eating a vegan or vegetarian diet. So it's something we want to be mindful of in terms of how we structure your protein sources to make sure that we have an adequate amount of omega-3s and not too much of these omega-6s. I think outside of, though, just the omega-6 conversation, the other piece of this is that corn and soy are also heavily genetically modified crops in the US. They are subsidized just like wheat is to make very large amounts of them that shouldn't normally be grown. And so they are heavily genetically modified. There's also a lot of pesticides, herbicides that are used on these plants, things like glyphosate and different types of herbicides that we know are really impacting the way that our body functions every day. They're impacting enzyme reactions and how our body can convert food into energy, and they can be carcinogens and a lot of other problems. And so corn and soy tend to be two of the more genetically modified and pesticide laden type food sources. So that's just something to think about. Obviously, you can get around that with purchasing glyphosate free, with purchasing organic. That helps with mitigating the genetically modified portion of things. But it doesn't take out the omega-6s from it, right? The omega-6s is part of its actual chemical structure of the food. So it's something you still have to be mindful of, even if you're buying the healthiest version of some of these. Now, with that in mind, I want to also talk about some of these healthier foods that a lot of individuals think that they should just be eating loads and loads of every day that actually could be fueling the inflammatory processes. So can you tell us what a couple of those classes of foods are that we see a lot of people are eating thinking that they're healthy, but that could actually be creating more of an inflammatory response?
Yeah, 100%. So we have this class of foods that we would consider being high in oxalates. Oxalates are by some referred to as anti-nutrients, and that's because they can bind up some other minerals that we're consuming, maybe some minerals that are even in the foods. And then aside from high oxalate foods, we are also considering foods that might be high in heavy metals. So when it comes to high oxalate foods, for example, spinach, which is a go-to leafy green for so many people, as well as almonds, which are a great nut to be including in the diet. It's all about the dose, right? So we want to make sure that when we're tossing leafy green into our smoothie, it's not always spinach. We're not just having spinach salads, but we have some variation there because we don't want to be bogging down our body with all these oxalates, which again can be binding up sulfur, iron, essential minerals such as those. And then when it comes to high heavy metal foods, brown rice, plant-based proteins, primarily because plant-based proteins might have a combination of brown rice, maybe it's pea protein as well. These are concentrated proteins. So whenever we're concentrating something, whatever is on the outside in the growing process, whatever is on the inside, so these heavy metals can be really integrated into the plant food from the soil. And when we are concentrating that down, distilling it down, isolating those protein sources, we're not necessarily getting rid of the heavy metals. We're concentrating the heavy metals even further. So if you're someone who's using a plant-based protein powder twice a day, we might want to consider how can we vary our protein sources to ensure that we're not bogging down the liver that has to process through these foods and pull out these toxins, heavy metals being one of those toxins. So brown rice, plant-based proteins, tuna, king mackerel, shark, swordfish, all those high mercury type fishes we want to be aware of as well. Some other things that we might not think about as much, dark chocolate has actually been shown in recent consumer reports that they've found high heavy metal in particular brands of dark chocolate, and then dried herbs as well, again, because heavy metals can be found in the soil and become integrated into the plant food as it's growing, and we don't necessarily exclude the heavy metals when we are processing or manufacturing these foods to be consumed.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that just purchasing organic for these foods doesn't actually change any of this. So organic can actually sometimes make the heavy metal content higher because the food is grown in its organic state, right? And so these foods inherently have these heavy metals in them, regardless if they're organic or not. And so we want to be mindful of purchasing from companies instead that are actually testing for heavy metals, that are reporting these things. There are companies out there that do that, or that's where we can work individually to support your body if you might have high heavy metal levels, to be able to help your body naturally detoxify them.
And again, for anyone who's like, okay, well, I don't know if I have high heavy metal levels, it goes back to, are we having inflammatory symptoms? Because that could be a potential root cause of what's driving this inflammation.
Totally. Yeah. And then I think the last one is just the how you're cooking some of these things too. Fried foods being problematic. They're obviously using hydrogenated oils with these, but it's also the frying process that tangles the proteins that are in the meat that is being fried that also creates carcinogens. Also in the frying process, you get oxidation of these oils, and that creates an inflammatory compound essentially in the oil. And so not only is frying problematic for fueling inflammation, but as is things like smoking and grilling, where you're getting a lot of this really high heat cooking, a lot of charring. Although those foods aren't deep fried and they're not being breaded and they maybe don't have as much oils in them, it's more so what's happening with the proteins that are in the meat that is being cooked that are getting tangled, that are creating these carcinogens. Carcinogens are related to cancer development. And so we just want to be really mindful of also the cooking process when it comes to some of these foods.
Absolutely. I think we've honed in a lot on foods that can fuel inflammation. So why don't we transition over to talking about some of these classes of foods, individual foods that might fight inflammation. Do you want to kick us off with talking about one of our favorites, antioxidants?
Yeah, antioxidants are definitely, I don't know, all of these are my favorites, but they're probably one of my top favorites, depending on the day. But antioxidants essentially do just what they say in the name. They block oxidation, which is oxidative stress. Oxidative stress causes inflammation. So they essentially help to be able to keep everything within balance. And that's all what this process is, right? Is that our body's naturally going to create free radicals. If there's going to be oxidative stress that is created in the process of things being made internally. But if we have enough antioxidants in our diet, then that helps us to be able to block any of the compounds that are being created from creating havoc and inflammation in the body. And we get antioxidants in things like leafy greens. So essentially everything except for spinach. That could be broccolis and kales and chards and such. You also get quite a bit of these in dark berries. So that's things like your blueberries and your cherries. Citrus fruits also contain a different type of antioxidant, which is vitamin C that you might be familiar with. We also can find that in camu powder. That's actually a berry that contains a ton of vitamin C. It's about 10 times as potent as is an orange. We also have different types of antioxidants like vitamin E. Vitamin E is a really potent antioxidant because it's a fat-soluble antioxidant. And we find a lot of vitamin E in olive oil, for example. Same thing with like avocados. So you're getting quite a bit of that there. Dark chocolate, if it is low in the cadmium and lead that we know it can tend to be an issue with, can also be a really great antioxidant because of the cacao content. That's a really potent polyphenol. Green tea also similarly has a lot of these polyphenols in it as well. So these foods are helping to be able to essentially block that oxidative stress that's going to then lead to inflammation. But alongside of that, we also need to make sure that our body has enough of the building blocks to do this process on its own, because our body is always going to use its endogenous supply of antioxidants first, which means it's going to use what's already found in the body before it then goes to these antioxidant food sources that I just mentioned. So we need to make sure we have them there because they're the secondary line of defense. But first and foremost, we have to make sure the body has enough of its own internal antioxidant. And that antioxidant is called glutathione. You might have heard of that guy before. There are foods that can help us make more glutathione. There's not really foods that contain glutathione, unfortunately. But when we eat enough sulfur, sulfur is a mineral that's found in a lot of foods. Sulfur and also amino acids like glycine, which are found in proteins that we eat, help us to be able to make this glutathione. And that is what is going to be that first line of defense as an antioxidant in the body. So you get sulfur in things like onions and garlic. You also get quite a bit in cruciferous vegetables like broccolis and cauliflowers. And then this glycine and glutamine, those amino acids, are found really in meat where the bone is present. So that's one of the benefits of things like bone broth and collagen and eating bone and proteins is that they're much richer in these amino acids, glycine and glutamine, that not only help with our gut healing, but also help to work with sulfur for us to make more of this glutathione, which is that body's first line of antioxidant defense. So I hope that gives you a good overview of how these antioxidants work. But you mentioned earlier, Romana, that the omega-3, omega-6 ratio is also incredibly important as it relates to inflammation. So we talked about omega-6s, how we need them, but we want to be mindful of how much and the sources of them. Let's talk about omega-3s and where they're found and why they're so important to regulating inflammation.
Absolutely. I love that you hit on so many of those helpful foods and food classes that you can incorporate into your diet to help fight inflammation. When it comes to omega-3s, as you mentioned, it's all about the ratio, omega-6 to omega-3. We don't need to get too bogged down with the numbers so long as we're making sure that we are incorporating a good amount of these omega-3 rich fat sources in the diet. So salmon, sardines, more of those fatty fishes, wild caught when we can get them wild caught. Also chia seeds, flax seeds, walnuts are great sources of omega-3s as well from more of a plant-based perspective. And then we can't forget about grass-fed beef. Grass-fed beef does have a good amount of omega-3 content. So those are all wonderful sources that we can incorporate. Aside from just that, again, other healthy fat sources that we want to incorporate as well, those extra virgin olive oils, cold pressed, avocado, coconut, things of that sort. So less strong in the omega-3s, but still important to incorporate these healthy fat sources when we can. And then some other foods that can help fight inflammation. You had already gone through, of course, antioxidants, sulfur, talking about that synergistic relationship between the sulfur and the glycine and the glutamine. But also we have some additional herbs that we can incorporate for that anti-inflammatory power. So turmeric and ginger are amazing herbs that have wonderful compounds. So curcumin is the active component of turmeric, which can be very anti-inflammatory. We can incorporate turmeric and ginger in powder form, tea form, which is a little bit less potent in terms of getting those active compounds, but still a great source to even help with digestion. And then we also have a class of herbs that we call chelating herbs. So chelating herbs help to bind up some of these heavy metals and effectively eliminate them from our body. So things like parsley, cilantro, chlorella, also great to incorporate. And then bitter vegetables are going to be very important for the liver. I know we've mentioned the liver a number of times today already, but we know that the liver is important in our detoxification processes, the natural detoxification processes of our body. So being able to support the liver supports detoxification processes. If we can incorporate sulfur and glycine and glutamine to help build glutathione in the body, glutathione's that master antioxidant that acts within the liver, again, to support our body's natural detoxification processes, effectively removing toxins from the body so that they don't further wreak havoc and promote inflammation in the body. So it really all is working together in a system. But bitter vegetables support the liver as well. So arugula, beets, lemon, any other citrus foods, as well as dandelion greens, dandelion tea, things of that sort are very supportive for the liver as well as digestion.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need all of those in the right conjunction. And I know earlier you mentioned with like some of the sugars, the added sugar sources, right, that there are problems with some of them that are based more in fructose, because we know fructose goes directly to the liver and that can be really problematic for inflammation. But there's also more minutia in terms of like how you eat these foods, right? And the metabolism and the digestive response that happens, because every time we eat, we have to metabolize, we have to digest, right? Our cells are getting information from the food that we eat. And so can you tell us a little bit about some of the other nutrition considerations that take the foods that we just talked about of like what to remove, what to add, and really put it into practice in terms of how those foods are paired together and why that's so important for us?
Absolutely. And of course, this is going to be where personalization comes in. So happy to meet with you for one-on-one nutrition counseling. If that's something that interests you, definitely contact the office and we'll be more than happy to set up an appointment. But having more of a one-on-one personalized plan can give us more direction in terms of how we can make an anti-inflammatory plan that's really tailored to you, how pairing foods together according to your schedule, your needs, your activity levels, how can we structure your meals? How can we build out your meals so that it's having enough protein, fat, and fiber? What portion sizes work best for you? We also want to consider not just our meals, but also our snacks. So can we think about our snacks as being more like mini meals that are also balanced to make sure that we're balancing blood sugar to help promote that optimal glucose response in the body. So that one-on-one nutrition support can be helpful for tailoring this plan and making these recommendations more personalized to you. Another thing that we want to consider in the realm of nutrition is our hydration status and our electrolytes. We know that we burn through these electrolytes, these minerals, when we're in that heightened stress response. So making sure that we're staying well hydrated, replenishing minerals where appropriate so that we can ensure that our body is being supported so that it can maintain a healthy stress response, especially if it's been years and years and years of chronic stress, chronic inflammation. Where are our nutrient levels at? How can we make sure that we're replenishing where we need to, supporting where we need to? So that pretty much wraps it up in terms of our nutrition strategies for inflammation. Lauren, do you want to let everyone know what the group session is going to be about this month?
Yeah, so we're going to be in our group session. If you're a PPMA patient, then we will be talking about some of the lifestyle and supplemental strategies for addressing inflammation. So today we talked specifically about dietary strategies. We'll talk more about lifestyle and supplements in our group session. So be sure to sign up for that or join us if you already are signed up. If you are not a PPMA patient and you would like to become one, you can use the information in the show notes below to give the office a call to learn more about the PPMA practice. And as a PPMA patient, you're also able to schedule a one-on-one call with Romana. So thank you guys so much for listening today. We'll be back in a couple weeks with a brand new topic, and we will see you guys soon.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Nourish MD, Dr. Dietitian Dialogues. This podcast is intended for general educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please consult with your healthcare provider before beginning any nutrition or supplement recommendations. Sign up for our mailing list so you'll never miss an episode of our wellness journey. See the podcast description for the link.